we need to do what's best for the company, best for the people. Sometimes that's exposing a blind spot. It needs to be exposed, but intent matters more than technique. Never correct anyone because your intention is that they're causing you pain and you want them to stop. Never correct someone with a perspective of selfishness.
No matter how strategic we want to be as leaders, we can never escape the reality that the quality of our relationships with those we lead has a huge influence on how creative, efficient, and effective our organizations are. I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Clayton Stenson, a consultant, fractional operations leader, and visionary about visionaries. What is that, you ask? A visionary about visionaries? Well, the answer to that question is one of the major reasons I wanted you to get to hear from Clayton. You see, I initially started getting to know Clayton about a year ago. During that time, I've come to learn that he has tremendous insight about the relationship between visionary leaders and the second-in-command operators who work for them. The road between today's realities and tomorrow's possibilities is fraught with challenges. Clayton has found that many of these challenges are not structural or strategic, but are first and foremost relational between visionaries and the operational leaders who report to them. Clayton's been down the road between today and tomorrow so many times himself, and has advised others about this road as well, that he's developed a way of thinking about the relationship between visionaries and their operational second-in-commands that we would all benefit from hearing about it. So, I asked him to be on the podcast to share his insights. But before we dig into the nitty-gritty of visionaries and their operational leaders, we get to hear about a couple of leaders who came to Clayton's defense early in life and left him with a leadership lesson that he follows even to this day.
I go all the way back to high school, and I can think of a couple situations. My grandmother passed away, and I had a math test, and right after that, and I failed it. And the math teacher was not going to give me a chance to rewrite it. And the social studies teacher stepped in and said, if Clayton says he needs to rewrite it, I trust him and I believe him, and you should let him rewrite it. And I remember thinking, wow, like that's a leader, an influencer in my life who stepped in to support me in a time of need. And I remember that was a big one. And then another one was a situation where I was a janitor at the school. My cousin's mom was the head janitor, and I was on staff there working. And the co-captain of the basketball team, I was a co-captain of the basketball team. When I was working, he snuck into the office and was doing some stuff on the computer. And the principal found out, and I got fired from the job because they thought that I had, helped him in there, but I hadn't. I didn't even know that he was in there. And again, she stood up for me and she went to bat for me. And she's like, Clayton wouldn't do that. He's a good kid. There's no way he would do it. And she fought for me and got me rehired. So those are, two situations that, were big influence on me. They were both in grade 12. It was just where someone that had influence and that was leading me in some capacity stood up for me and fought for my best interests.
How does the kind of effective reality of those experiences, how does that show up for you today in the places where you lead and influence?
Yeah, I would say that I look for opportunities to believe the best in people rather than to judge. Like, I try not to jump to conclusions and react, right? I'd rather, ask questions and explore and discover the truth and then respond appropriately.
How often would you say, as you take that discovery approach, how often would you say that the end conclusion of the fullness of the story turns out to be something more or a little bit different, or maybe even a lot different than what your initial impression is? How often is there a deviation as you explore?
I would say almost every time, right? There's always more to the story. There's always at least two perspectives on every situation, right? Well, three really. There's my perspective as the leader manager. Then there's the one person who's involved and the other person involved. There's at least three perspectives, but there's only one truth.
How do you keep your foot in the door to keep that kind of curiosity open, if you will?
I guess it's just like humility, right? Like the reality is I don't know everything, right? Like I'm not perfect. I'm fallible, right? Like we all are, whether we admit it or not. I mean, I guess like we chatted recently about self forgetfulness, right? And not thinking about yourself and your own, your own desires or your own insecurity or whatever it is. Like I'll give you an example. I'm starting with a new fractional client on Monday, and I was meeting with the leadership team on Wednesday, and I said to them, I think the answers are already here, right? Like I'm not coming in with the answers. I think the answers are already here. It's my job to find them and then hold you accountable to execute them. I can be an instrument for finding those ideas and executing it, but they're not my ideas. It's much better if you guys arrive at the ideas, but it's my job to ask you and draw them out and then execute them.
It's amazing, and to me, it just shows the continuous, you can't avoid it, you can't fight it connection between who we are and what we do as leaders. Is that as we can discipline ourselves or become, so that's just how we show up, more humble, and take that very attitude that you just described, the side benefit, which I think is actually quite important and valuable, comes in the ownership of solution. Because when you come in as kind of the expert guru who's got all the answers and you just bestow upon everybody with your greatness, even if you're accurate, even if you're right, you've got a different problem now because you don't have the buy-in and ownership of execution that you really need to move forward. So as you show up with curiosity and humility and acknowledge the knowledge of the people in the room and how do we help unearth some things that are already here, when it's time to go forward in those conclusions, the fact that they have authored what needs to happen and how that creates a much greater commitment as opposed to you will do this, instead it's we came up with this. So there's just so much more buy-in, and if you don't have that, it's going to be a long road. It's going to be a lot harder. So I love the way that humble curiosity actually leads in to what I might suggest in the long run is probably a more efficient outcome in the long run, because what comes along with their ideas is their commitment to following through.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I do it. And then the other thing is too, as a fractional, I'm only going to be there for 6 to 12 months. So I don't want to make them dependent upon me, right? Like I'm intentionally leading in such a way that they're not dependent on me so that when I leave, it's an easier transition for the next guy.
That makes total sense. What's really interesting about that is that there's probably an element of that that we should all be leading with at all times, whether we're fractional or not. It's a little more poignant in your situation, but am I thinking as a leader, if we won't use the getting hit by a truck, let's just say won the lottery and so decided not to work anymore, whatever reason, how would this place function without me, and am I thinking about how to get it to that spot on a regular basis?
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up because that's also another formative experience in my life. So my first office role was at my church. The situation was that 9 months prior, our executive pastor had died from a brain tumor, and I came on board and was taking on responsibility for things. And I'm like, okay, well, how do I do this? Where's the instructions? Where's the manual? Where do I learn this? And there isn't one, and the reality was that in that situation, it was all in his head, right? And it wasn't written down. And so I learned this because I had to start from scratch because someone else didn't learn this, right? So I actually worked there for 7 years, and I intentionally had this in the back of my mind all the time. I'm going to make sure that if I get hit by a bus or something happens to me, that the next person is not going to have to start from zero. And what ended up happening was my wife and I had our first baby, and he died after a day and a half. And then I'm like, I can't work right now. But I was able to meet with an intern that was under me at that time and like walk through in 2 hours and explain to him, here's where you go for everything that you're going to need to fill my role. I don't know how long I'll be out, but here it is. And he actually did quite well in that role when I was gone. I was gone for 10 weeks. So
What a terrible experience to have to, lean into the human side of that story. With the organizational side of the story being that you had fostered capacity in the organization to carry on. It's, maybe my engineering brain's kicking in today, but I'm thinking about potential energy. And are we putting the ball at the top of the ramp? So all you have to do is give it a little nudge and then it rolls down the hill. When it sits at the top of that ramp, it's got a ton of potential energy. But that ball doesn't get up there unless people like you and people like me intentionally put it up there. It doesn't automatically go up there. You have to do the work to get that thing set up. And obviously, a horrible personal situation as you're describing there, but then you're able to lean into the capacity building work that you had created ahead of time. How do you get people to have an urgency around creating capacity growth in the organization when there's not an emergency on the horizon, when there's not a big personnel turnover thing that's about to happen? How do you do that? How do you prioritize that in the midst of the day to day?
well, I think for me, every organization I've been a part of has been way too reactive and not proactive enough. And so, for me, the entrepreneurial operating system was the solution in the first organization that I just discovered that when I was working there. And so, just implementing a system where you have a rhythm of stopping, putting your phone aside, and like thinking and being intentional to build the business you want, right? And not just be running from fire to fire. Especially in a smaller organization, I think that's just kind of becomes the routine. It's just the way we do things, and I don't know, probably in a bigger business it's the same, but I haven't worked in a lot of large businesses personally. And then for me, like modeling it right for other people, doing the one-to-ones and building a relationship and just really speaking into situations when you see people not not managing that stuff well.
One of the things I really like about what you just said is you said, I haven't worked in a lot of larger organizations. And, I think the majority of our audience here are leaders who are working in larger organizations. And so there's this temptation to say, well, of what value then is to the larger organization? And I have a very simple answer to that, which is that we continuously learn from other contexts about leadership, whether it's from education or athletics or larger firms, learning from smaller firms or vice versa. And it's really interesting because when you think about behemoth organizations, what's the one thing that they're constantly talking about that they're after that they can't get, which is the ability to shift quickly, the ability to be nimble, the ability, interestingly enough, to be a smaller organization. So while smaller organizations certainly have their limitations because they don't necessarily have the resources that a larger organization would have, it's very interesting. It's almost like a grass is greener kind of situation. In some ways, where we want the things that we don't have. And so, in the midst of our conversation, I don't find it to be a detriment at all for our listeners that you spent your career in smaller organizations because half of them are trying to think about how to operate smaller anyway. So, how can we have all these resources and still have a nimbleness to us as we look at the marketplace? So, I love that that's your background. Well, one of the great motivations that I have about wanting folks to hear from you is a unique perspective that you have on the relationships between the top two people in an organization. And given that you've worked in smaller organizations, it really fits from a thematic standpoint because we're essentially talking about the visionary who's often the founder in the worlds in which you have been and the second in command. So here's a person with grand ideas which helped, get this thing started in the first place, but at some point there's the realization that I can't do this. I need help. We need execution oriented minded people, not just people like me. This is a visionary speaking. And so as you have lived and worked around that dynamic, you have seen and identified a continuum there between the visionary and the second in command that I think is really worth all of us pausing and learning from and listening to you about. So jump in here, talk to us a little bit about this dynamic, how you see it, how you've observed it, and how you would encourage us to think about the interplay.
Yeah, so I'll tell a little bit of the story of how I came up with this. So initially, I mentioned working at the church. That was my first visionary. And I wasn't second in command, but we didn't really have one. So I was the closest thing that we had to it. So that was 7 years working with him. Then I left there and I went and worked at a construction company. Quickly recognized that, okay, I'm working with another visionary now. But I learned a lot in the first engagement that I could apply, particularly I'm not going to judge him for being different from me. And I realized I need to find my voice to advocate for the opposite, perspective, more so with this second visionary. And then I did end up in the second in command role in that organization, and it was extremely effective, like incredibly effective. We 22 times net profit in 12 months when I was promoted to that role, and we implemented EOS in that company. And then I left there, and then later on in my journey, I had the opportunity to do fractional work. And my first fractional client, it was a challenging situation because, firstly, we weren't a very good values match, which I think is extremely important. Because of that, once I got a little further into the organization and recognized some of the things that were happening, I ended up resigning the position because it wasn't going to work. So after that, I thought, okay, well, I need to process this. Why did this not work? And how do I make sure I never end up in another engagement like this again? And so this is where this continuum came from. And I started to recognize that, okay, I think there's 4 types of visionaries. And I recognize that 2 of them I want to work with, one of them maybe, and one of them no chance, basically. So the first type of visionary, and this is the one I don't ever want to work with, I call a flaming visionary. And I refer to them as this because, essentially a visionary is meant in my mind to be a spark plug, right? Like they make things run. Without a spark plug, your car cannot move, right? And I believe visionaries are very much like that. They're the spark. They make it happen. They make it go. I'm from Canada, and up here we have a lot of forest fires, and a spark is not always a good thing if it's not, in the right place, right? So a flaming visionary, sparks are flying everywhere, right? And it's causing chaos. And so I experienced this with my first visionary. He just had so many ideas, and nobody was filtering them, nobody was challenging them. He was changing directions constantly, and everyone's like, "What? I thought we were doing this. I thought we were doing that." Right? And it's very hard to navigate that world if you work for a visionary like that, and it just leaves a path of wreckage everywhere and carnage and confusion.
So that causes me to pause for just a second and say, all right, for those of us that might land ourselves more in the visionary category than the second in command, the question would be, am I a flaming visionary? Am I sending sparks not in a controlled, directed, it's still a spark, it's still got a little wildness to it. If it's a spark, it's not like this nice tame thing, but is it contained in a direction that we can do something with? And I might be feeling just a tinge of conviction as you talk about this, Clayton, because with our team in November, we had a meeting and I was handed the edict, which says, we are not creating new things in 2024, Tim. Are you hearing me? We're not creating a bunch of new. We have some, I shouldn't say that. We have some things that are already planned that we're creating that are new. We're not creating any more. Please don't say yes to things that will require us to create more new things than we're already planning. We need the capacity to put towards what we already have. And so then I've been thinking about this over the last month since we got together and trying to kind of bridle situations. I'm not trying to create mayhem, but when a client asks for something and you're like, "Oh, we're so close. If we were to just tweak this and that, we could." And it's not even really about. It's not about the money or the opportunity. It's about how do we help and serve. These are with clients that we're already working with, so it's not about even getting new business. And I'm like, "Oh yeah." And before I'm thinking before I say yes, let me talk to the team. Let me count the cost. I wouldn't have counted the cost before, but they're saying, "Hey Tim, we need that spark to have some type of container around it, lest we all burn out."
There's a place for that. I would say that's in like a same page meeting or a leadership team meeting, right? Where you can throw around ideas, but I think the danger is when you're throwing around ideas with people that don't recognize that they're just ideas and that they don't actually have to action on it. They'll be like, okay, I need to do that, right? And then it creates confusion and chaos. Whereas, if you do that in a same page meeting with your second in command, they're gonna filter that. They're gonna have a discussion. Hopefully, they'll resist, push back against you, like you just described, right? And then you'll make the best decision for the team, right? And not just make a decision because you're feeling like you should do that. What I would say is probably it's not malicious. It's just that visionaries just are a certain way, and you can't, you can't stop it, right? You just need to learn how to target it, focus it in a way that's more productive.
Yeah, the old sports analogy. You can't stop him; you can only hope to contain him. Seems like it might apply here. So, flaming tends towards significant chaos. Talk to us about, walk us through the rest of the continuum.
Yeah. So what I realize is what the next step is that generally in my experience with everyone that I've met over the years is that something happens that humbles them. So I call the next phase humbled with a D, not humble, but humbled, right? So it's like something has happened to make me as the visionary recognize that maybe I'm not everything that this organization needs. And maybe I have weaknesses that need to be compensated for, or, someone needs to be hired that's different from me. I think often visionaries naturally like to hire people just like them because they get them. If you do that, you just create more chaos. You really need to have someone different than you. So humbled is it's unfortunate. I think we've all been humbled, in our journey at some point or another, and it's been a great moment of change and growth. But it hurts. The danger with a humbled visionary is that you don't know where they're going to go next. If they're going to revert back into their old habits and shift back into flaming again, or if they're going to truly embrace what they learned in that humbled time and actually move to the third stage, which I call humble.
So you go from being humbled in a moment to actually being more of a humble person just on the regular. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah, humbled is situational, right? It's easy to be humble when something's happened that's kind of forced you to be, right? Like your business is fallen apart, or something bad has happened, or your wife leaves you or something, like, right, like it's easy to be humbled in those situations. But when the storm passes, are you going to continue to be humble, or are you going to shift back into your old habits, right? So that's why I said there's one that I won't work with, there's one that I'm cautious to work with, right? And then there's the two that I like working with, is the humble, and then the fourth one, which we'll get.
If the flaming visionary in general, on average, is producing chaos, in that next phase or stage of humbled, situationally humbled, but not yet to being a on average humble leader, in that space of situationally being humbled, what would you call that moment in parallel? If chaos is what comes along with flaming, is it a pause? Is it a breath? What is it that you would say is organizationally true in that moment with the leader that steps into that humbled phase, whether they wanted to or not?
I'd say like depression or stress, like, like anxiety, right? Like they've just come to the end of themselves, and they're like, I don't know what to do here anymore. So I can't, I can't continue to do what I've always been doing, because it's not working, right? So I would say it's probably a very hard season, not just for them but for their team. It's hard to rally your team when you're in that, place.
So, is there a litmus test to find out whether the humbled leader is going to take the next step to humility, or go back up to chaos and live there? Is there a way to know or predict what's going to happen next?
I don't know. I don't know that I've figured that out yet. When I'm trying to figure that out, I just ask a lot of questions, right? It's like, what did you learn? What have you learned that you do differently now? Those kinds of, like, just delve in and try to get a sense of where their head's at. But that's a tough one. That's why I said I'm hesitant to work with humbled, because you just really don't know. Like I've said this before in leadership, you can't evaluate someone when, for example, they have three hats. They're wearing three hats in the business. You can't evaluate someone's effectiveness when they're grossly overloaded with work, right? Like that's just not fair. So I'd say it's kind of similar. It's hard to evaluate somebody when they're in a low point, a humbled point.
All right, so let's take that example of the person that doesn't kind of climb back up to flaming visionary, but takes that step from humbled to humble, and kind of living in a more constant state of that. Talk to us a little bit about what happens next in your observation and experience.
I just want to be clear. I don't think you're ever like fully one of these things, right? Like I think you can bounce, right? Like, it's easy in a moment to become flaming and then be like, oh, right, I just realized I became flaming there, and I'm sorry, right? Like I give an example of parenting. Like I have kids, right? And sometimes I'm really great. I've got it together. I'm calm. There it's chaotic, but then other times I lose it, right? Like I just, I get angry and I yell at them, and then afterwards I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have yelled at them, right? But I think where humble comes in is that you recognize that, right? And you're like, that was wrong. I think maybe the best example of humble is that you'll admit that, right? That you'll
Hmm.
apologize. My father and my first visionary almost never apologized for anything, right? And they made mistakes,
Hmm.
right? Like we all make mistakes, right? But I think a humble visionary will own that, right? Will apologize, and will not be afraid to mention the things that they've done wrong, and be vulnerable and authentic. And then humble also, you recognize and start to hire people and develop people that are different from you. My second visionary was really good at this. Like I'll just tell that story a little bit. When he hired me as an estimator, he said, Clayton, I hate spreadsheets and I don't want to learn them. Right. And he's like, can you be my estimator? Right. And I'm like, well, I've never worked in commercial construction before. Are you sure this is a good idea? And he's like, well, I know you're good with numbers and I know you can do this and I'll help you. Right. And I excelled. And then when he promoted me the integrator to second in command, he said, Clayton, whenever I touch operations, it blows up in my face and I know you'll be good at it. So I'm going to give it to you. And his self-awareness and humility to admit that he's not good at something. And it wasn't just to me that he would say that. He'd said that to everyone. Right. And he was okay with that. It's like, I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm not good at. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm good at something that I'm not. So that unique ability, that zone of genius, like just discovering and focusing on that and then allowing people that are better at the things you're not good at to thrive in those areas. So I think a lot of this is self-awareness.
What's this next phase? Because as we talk about humble, it's like, hey, this sounds pretty good. I mean, I hear somebody who is willing to acknowledge when they screw things up and seems open to taking their hands out of places where it's not adding value. So what's the next level here that we haven't even, gotten into yet?
Yeah, I call it enlightened. I haven't experienced too many of these, just to be honest, but I have experienced a couple of them, and it's really refreshing. And I would say back to self forgetfulness. They're just genuinely they've let go, right? Like they're probably not really involved very much in the day to day anymore. So they probably own multiple companies and they've let go of the leadership of those companies on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. I just met with one like this actually just recently. I didn't just never even clicked that that's what she is, but she said, Clayton, I make X amount of money. I won't say who much it is or who it is, but she said, I work 4 days a year. The number was multiple six figures. And I said, what? And she's like, I have a good team and they run it. And basically, I show up once every quarter and I shake hands and kiss babies and give them whatever they need, right, from me. And then I'm gone till next quarter. And so
Hmm.
enlightened is a whole nother level. Like there's just so much trust, and surrounded with such good people. And they usually joke about their weaknesses. And it's beautiful because the team just rallies around them.
Yeah, if you enjoy working with that kind of visionary. Now, some people might resent it, like, well, wait a second. Now they're the owner of these enterprises, and so that's kind of how they get compensated. Do you find anybody who wishes that the person was more involved there day to day, or like, no, that can work really well?
I think that's possible. I would say probably more so possible with new people to the organization, because if the person that works there has been there a long time, they've probably seen them in other situations and seen the influence and the effort and blood, sweat, and tears that it took to get it to where it is, and would appreciate that. But if the core leadership team that is running the thing has that level of trust and respect for them, I would say they probably are showing that to the team and modeling that to the team, and the team's going to follow them.
So I'm imagining now some folks that are listening, whether in larger organizations or smaller, that have this kind of, they know the leader that they work for, and that leader's, if that's a kind of visionary type of leader, somebody who's looking forward, and they're kind of going through these 4 phases, 4 stages, flaming humble to humble, enlighten, and thinking, okay, where does my visionary land and where do I land? And so I guess I would say to you, help us land. Like, so what do we do with this in terms of moving forward, whether as a visionary or as a second in command? What is it to take this kind of stage development of visionary leadership and put it into real life practice, leverage it in order to make things better?
When I coach people on this stuff, I start with awareness. I think it's good to do different kinds of assessments to determine what your natural tendencies are. So if you're familiar with the Colby A assessment, it's really good, recognizes your natural tendency for risk and, need for information, all these kinds of things. There's, working genius. There's, different kinds of assessments, that 360 evaluations. It starts with awareness, right? If you're not really willing to be real about who you are and where you're at, and listen to the people around you, also give feedback about who you are and where you're at, then, you're not going to be able to move along the spectrum, right? So if you're a visionary and you're listening and you're like, yeah, maybe I am flaming, ask your closest people on your team, ask your direct reports, get them to watch this.
Speaking of in the hot seat, like I'm not going to be able to avoid this conversation internally now. I mean, I can have you on the podcast. It's like my whole team is going to be working on this podcast. So, so I have nowhere to hide is what I am saying.
It's a good thing, right? But like I said before, it hurts in the moment, right? But if you truly care about your organization and the impact you're trying to have, this is important, right? Because if you can step through to humble, which I would say is inwardly sound, we got to get to that place where we're inwardly sound, and you can't be inwardly sound without being humble, in my opinion. You have to just be real about it. And when we get to that place of humility, then I feel like that's the step towards growth and becoming the best that you can become. And it doesn't just affect your business, it affects your entire life, right? Like it's just this journey of growth. And maybe I'll switch gears here a little bit, because when I was preparing this and I'm reflecting on my journey and all the 15 years of working with visionaries, I recognized this applies to the second in command too. And I looked back on my years at the church and I recognized I was a flaming second in command. Like I wasn't second in command, but I was a flaming leader on the other side. And how a flaming second in command is that they're so concerned about process and systems and doing things right that they don't bring the people with them, right? It's like, this is what you need to do. I thought this through. You need to do it this way, right? And they wouldn't. And now I look back and it's like, I know why, because they probably thought I was a jerk, right? They're like, I don't want to follow that guy. I don't want to follow his system, right? Like he's just a jerk, right? Like whatever, right? So now I don't lead like that because it doesn't work. It's flaming second in command. Now I have to come in humble, like we talked about at the beginning. What do you guys think? The ideas are in the room. How do I draw them out? How do I bring people along with me and we build it together so it's theirs, right? And so the same thing happens with a second in command. You come to a point where you're humbled. It's like, I feel like I have the right plan here, but nobody's following me. So, maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was, and something needs to change.
Well, what's really interesting in that example there is it may not be, I think there's a tendency for an operator to look at the process. And if it's people aren't following the process, you're suggesting that the solution is not a better process. The solution is a more well-developed person. Maybe the process doesn't change at all. Maybe the process is exactly what it needs to be, but we don't have anybody, willingly or enthusiastically flowing into it because there's something in the way. There's a blockage. And if that blockage is me as a person, me as a leader, then the best process, the best strategy doesn't yield very much, because ultimately we need people's enthusiasm, we need people's energy, we need people's buy-in, we need people's ideas. We need them to come into the system and not only just kind of follow, but also contribute and commit and own. And so it's really interesting because this operational leader influencer that we're talking about, a COO, if you will, in some regards, might be very tempted to think that their system is the problem if people aren't following, when in fact it may have nothing to do with the system itself at all and everything to do with the person.
One thing I say with my clients quite often is, We want to make sure that we get people's bodies by default. Like, they're there because they want to get a paycheck. We want their mind, right, as well, because their mind is important. But what we truly want is their heart, right? We want them to buy in at such a level that they love being here, and it's fulfilling work and that kind of thing. And you don't get that as a flaming. You might be able to scare people into submission in the short term, but you can't get long term engagement and results by being flaming.
I love that you use the term long term there, because there's an implication in it, in that some of these things that are not so effective in the long term can actually work in the short term. And so kind of threat and fear and all of that, it has you can see a positive effect from these things. It's just not a long term strategy. In my mind, it's a super highway with a dead end. Like, you can get there really fast, but eventually you're not going to be able to go anywhere, and the person that's on the actual highway without maybe even a country road, we could say, without the blockage, it might take them a little longer to get there, but in the long run they go much 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 further and produce so much more of a result, because they didn't take the fear shortcut, which, again, it can be really effective in the short run, but the things we're talking about are long run success for organizations and leaders, not just the short run stuff. As we wrap up here, and you think about advice for visionaries, advice for the second in command operators that support the organization that these visionaries have in many cases founded, or at least now are leading, what kind of advice would you have for these two groups?
One, I'll say, for somebody who's new to having a second in command or new to working with a visionary, don't try to change each other. So I've been married for 13 years. I use this as an analogy all the time. My wife and I spent way too much of our first 10 years of marriage trying to change each other. And it doesn't work. you can't. You can't change each other, nor should you want to, because it's the differences that make the magic happen, that make it worthwhile. It's harder. Definitely it's harder on the short term, in the short term, to learn to work together with someone who's very different from you. But it's much more effective in the long run. So that would be my advice, because there's a tendency, I think, if you're visionary, you've never had a second in command, and now all of a sudden this person's asking you questions and poking holes in all of your ideas. Like, it's really annoying, right? Like, just go away and let me do what I want to do, like I've always been doing, right? But then as the or the second command, the visionaries, the loose cannon all over the place. It's like, man, he is so driving me crazy. He's causing all these problems, blah blah blah. I wish he would just change. Well, he's not going to, right? In large part, hopefully he will over time, allow you to help him focus. For the existing person, I would say, you know, be open and honest. I think where I really failed in my first visionary relationship was that I wasn't open and honest. I wasn't, like, he would do things that would bother me and I wouldn't react, right? Like, I wouldn't like lash out at him. I would just bottle it, right? Because he's the owner or the leader, the founder, and I'm just an employee. So there was a level of fear, right, to say anything. But ultimately, I don't think I did any service to him by not expressing how what he did, how it impacted me, but how it impacted the organization as well, right? So I think we need to do what's best for the company, best for the people. Sometimes that's exposing a blind spot, right? That needs to be exposed. But I think you and I talked about this before, that intent matters more than technique. Never correct anyone because your intention is that they're causing you pain and you want them to stop. Like, never correct someone with a perspective of selfishness, right? Like, I want you to stop doing this because it's a pain in my butt, right? Like, you need to do it from a heart of, I care about you, and this is holding you back, or this is holding the company back, or your department back, or whatever it is, right? Like, the intention needs to be for them, like a caring, loving intention. So if you can't get there, then don't do it until you can.
It's really fascinating to think about that because I just kind of imagine in my own mind as you're saying that, what happens when somebody says, "Hey, I think you should change your course of action and how you do this. And here's why, for the sake of the organization. Here's why, for the sake of our clients. Here's why, for the sake of the employees here," is so wildly different than, "Would you stop doing that?" Which really, without any other explanation or out any other conversation, really feels like you're pissing me off and annoying me. And it's about, caretaking for me, as opposed to clients, employees, the mission of the organization. And so it's very difficult if the message is, "You're annoying me because I like to operate differently than you." That is not a compelling argument to a visionary. It's not going to get them to say, "Hey, yeah, let's make those changes," because why? Because it's just more convenient for you. But when you're able to say and come from a place that's not about personal preference, but it's about bigger things like mission and clients and employee engagement and satisfaction, it's a totally different conversation. It's a completely, I think you really, if the second in command is able to do that, and I'm not suggesting that it's easy because it would be very difficult, especially as the visionaries making your life hard. But if you're able to come at it genuinely, I mean, not just the facade of, but actually for the sake of these other things that are more important, and not deep down just for I like it better this way, I have to think that there's a boatload of visionaries that would be able to engage in that conversation far more effectively if a second command chose that it's not about me route to talk about these things.
Those first 7 years working with the visionary, I didn't do that well, but nearing the end, I was starting to learn and recognize that I had to, for the good of the organization, I had to find my voice, and I had to figure out how to communicate things in a way that he could understand. Anytime that I came with an objection that's backed up with logic and reasoning that made sense to him, they always relented. But if I came with just like feelings, the typical visionary type is not that concerned about how you feel. They're driven, they're going for it. And that's a gift. It's a gift, right? Because if you're concerned about everyone's feelings, you're not going very far, right? Because there's always going to be people around you that aren't happy.
It's hard. I mean, it puts a lot of the onus back on, in this case, the second in command, who's maybe kind of pulling their hair out anyway. But it's also a good check, I would say. And we could have a whole nother conversation about how visionaries need to check themselves. But ultimately, to say to for the second command to look in the mirror and say to himself or herself, "Why am I pushing for this? Really?" Because it begins with a really honest conversation with myself. To say that it's about the organization or the customers or the other employees when it's really not, that's a bad idea. That's you just kind of painting over a selfish motive. And so I think the
Mm.
first part is really that hard conversation with the mirror. Am I just stumping for my preferences? Is that really all this is about? Because that's not a compelling argument. It's really not, because your preferences, you might think that they're better because they're your preferences, but the visionary doesn't think that. The visionary was kind of fine, just kind of, well, we've got some chaos, but that's just how it is. Okay. So I think the first step really on the second in command side is a really hard conversation with self about, is this really just my preference of how I work, or is it really truly about the future of the organization, of the mission, of customers, of the employees? Is it really, really about that?
And I would say it's the same for the visionary, right? Like if you have an emotional response where you're pushing your agenda, right? You look yourself in the mirror and really be honest, right? Is this what's best for the company, or is this my opinion? When you can get to the point where you can be honest with yourself in both those chairs, and ultimately honest with yourselves, looking at each other instead of the mirrors, that's where the beauty of the two working together comes. It's like we can be real open and honest. And I could even ask you, if you were my visionary Tim, I could ask you that question. Do you really think that's what's best for the company? Tell me why. Like, convince me, because I'm open to it.
What a great conversation. Yeah.
Right. And vice versa. Right. Like, let's just put it all on the table, right? Like, let's just go for it and fight it out until we arrive at what's best, right? That's when it really is incredible. And I've been a part of that, and it's great. But it's not very common. When I was in university, I lived in a dorm, like in a residence, and I was across the hall from me was this guy who was like he was like a punk rocker. He had like huge speakers in his room, and he was the kind of guy who'd stay up till like 4 in the morning and sleep till noon. And I wasn't like that at all. Like we were just very different from each other, but we got along so well. Like we were really good friends, and it was just beautiful, right? That two people that are so different could really find that solid relationship. And my second visionary, I went for supper with him last week on Thursday, and we laughed and laughed and laughed and about our differences, and we worked so well together. And I just encourage you, like, we really need to bring down those walls because there's some beauty on the other side. It's just really beautiful, when two people that are so different can find unity and really leverage each other's unique abilities and zone of genius.
I'm willing to bet that as you listened to my conversation with Clayton, that you got a sense for his winsomeness. This is just somebody that you want to lean into, somebody that you want to interact with. Certainly a humility there that is so attractive, and it causes us. I mean, it's kind of a simple lesson example for some of the things that we were talking about during the discussion, which is to say, leaders who show up with humility are more attractive to us, and they cause us to want to lean in. And I feel that from Clayton all over the place. So I love how he walked us through these stages of the visionary leader, from flaming to humbled, from humbled to humble, and from humble ultimately to enlightened. But you notice there's no guarantee. It's not like a slide at a playground that once you start to go down, you're going to go to the bottom. It's possible to go from flaming to humbled and then go right back up to flaming and stay there. And so there is not an inevitability here that we end up in great places. And then I so appreciated at the end as he brought it back around and said, you know what, these ideas don't just apply to the visionaries, they apply to the second in commands as well. They apply in similar ways to the second in command. And it's important for that group to also think about, am I flaming in the way that I lead as a second in command towards operations? Is there that stage progression for me as well into humbled and then humble and then enlightened as well? So I just appreciate that construct. I think we need mental models like these to help us move forward more effectively. Of course, boots on the ground in action is where it really happens ultimately. But for us to think through these things and really understand, where am I? Back to the self-awareness that he was talking about. Where do I fall in this continuum right now? And where would my team, where would the people that I lead, if I'm a visionary, or if I'm a second in command, where would my visionary assess that I am? And there are some of you right now who might be thinking, I need to have a conversation. I'm a second in command who needs to have a conversation about this with the visionary. I'm the visionary who might need to have this conversation with the second in command. It might even be an interesting way to go about this, to put this episode to that person and say, hey, let's both listen to this and then let's have a conversation. Now, given all that, I want to take a turn here as we wrap up, because I am feeling personally very convicted. The reality is, and I'm just going to be a little bit more open on the personal side here, is even last night, I had a conversation with my wife about humility, or my lack of it, my lack of willingness or ability to communicate that I've made a mistake or created a problem for somebody else. And so it's impossible for me to lean into the conversation that had so much grounding in the idea of humility and not admit that I'm in the midst of a thought like that. And so we might say, in a business podcast like this one, what does the family dynamic have to do with the business? And my answer is everything. Because ultimately, I don't want to be just a good leader at business. I want to be a good leader everywhere, and that includes with my family. And so as I sit here recording this episode with Clayton, and we bring up the term humility over and over and over again, it puts a pit in my stomach regarding the conversation that I had just last night. Our definition of humble that we use with our clients is having a mindset of self-forgetfulness, a willingness to see and admit fault, and an eagerness to learn from and acknowledge others. And so when you walk through that, you heard Clayton talk about self-forgetfulness. We talked about the need to see and admit faults. And you can even hear in that, does the visionary have an appreciation for the second in command who's trying to bring operational excellence to the game? Does the second in command have an appreciation for what the visionary brings? So in all three aspects of that definition, there's a lot of important things to consider. But in this moment, I'm going to stay where I am, which is sitting in this space, not with regard to business in this moment, but with regard to my marriage and my parenting. And so normally at this moment, I would say to you, that brings me to the question that I want to leave you with today. But I'm going to switch it up just a little bit this time and say that leads me to the question I want to leave myself with today. And if that question happens to apply to you, that's great. But I'm going to say it to myself, and the rest of you can determine whether or not it applies to you as well. And that question is this: am I being a humble leader? This is Tim Spiker, reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.